Okay, everyone. Welcome to Warner Historical Society's first Zoom presentation on Warner's Railroads. My name is Lynn Clark. I'm the Executive Director of the Warner Historical Society, and you'll also be hearing from Rebecca Courser, who is the former director and the all-around expert on Warner history. This program is part of a multi-organization collaboration of the Muse Group entitled All Aboard: Economic, Social, and Environmental Change During New Hampshire's Railroad Era. The project explores the impact of the railroad on rural New Hampshire towns and Native American groups across the United States. Our goal is for people to look beyond the trains and stations to see the changes in society facilitated by railroads. Our presentation this evening will explore Warner's 7 railroad depots and will serve as an introduction to the other talks in the series. We will speak about the politics behind the depot's locations, the individuals who laid the tracks, and those that worked at the stations. We will begin to explore how their placement affected businesses and farms, topics that we will delve into more deeply in subsequent talks. The programs and exhibits of All Aboard are funded in part by a grant from New Hampshire Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. For information on more railroad programs and exhibits, see nhmuse.org. And so we begin.
The start of the Concord and Claremont line emanated from Concord. This is an image of the fourth and last passenger station in Concord, built in 1885. It cost $250,000 to build and covered 100,000 square feet, making it one of the largest buildings in northern New England. In 1880, there were 35 railroad companies operating over 1,000 miles of track in New Hampshire. Within 10 years, all of those companies had merged and formed 2, the Concord and Montreal and the Boston and Maine. By June of 1895, the B&M had acquired a monopoly after purchasing a 91-year lease with the Concord and Montreal. The Concord station had 50 acres of freight yard, 40 miles of track, and an average of 40,000 freight cars a month moving in and out of its hub. 25 passenger trains departed daily. 11 of those were for Boston. The shops employed 1,300 people and covered 6 acres of facilities. Within Concord and New Hampshire railroading, politics and corruption were inseparable. It was said that the president of the B&M governed the state. This grand station was torn down in the 1960s to build a shopping plaza on Storrs Street.
The railroad to Warner was originally charted as the Concord and Claremont on June 24, 1848. 6 of the 17 incorporators were from Warner: Harrison Robertson, Robert Thompson, Franklin Simons, Stephen Badger, Samuel Jones, and Daniel Bean. Their purpose was to make a preliminary survey of the route. The individual sums contributed ranged from $1 to $15, and that was allowed as credit against the first assessment of stock taken in the railroad. Why would these men be interested in promoting the building of a railroad through Warner? Several of them served in local and state politics as selectmen and state representatives. Robertson owned a mercantile store in Cooperage and served in town and state government. Thompson operated a dry goods store and was elected town clerk. Franklin Simons served as tax collector and county sheriff. Stephen Badger grew up in Warner and had an established law practice in Concord. Samuel Jones was a farmer, and Daniel Bean was engaged with the mills in Waterloo and had an extensive farm. These men knew the advent of the railroad would be a boon, not only to their businesses, but also to the mill owners, merchants, and farmers in the area.
Construction began on November 1848, and amazingly, about 10 months later, on September 21, 1849, the railroad was formally opened to Warner. To celebrate the event, a train of 9 cars with 500 people from Warner and other towns was dispatched to Concord in the morning from Warner. At 11 o'clock, an expanded train of 18 cars carrying 800 people started the return journey. 2 locomotives were required for this extra heavy train load. One was placed in the front, the other in the rear. A fatal accident occurred when a coupling broke. Several people were thrown from a car and injured. Matthew Gould from the Roby section of Sutton, a young man and brother to the conductor Moses Gould, had both of his legs crushed and died upon arriving at the hospital. This unfortunate incident cast a shadow on the subsequent festivities, but the train continued on to Warner, arriving at about 1 o'clock. There, a procession guided by Daniel Bean as marshal and headed by the Fisherville Band marched along Main Street and back to the speaker stand near the depot. Speeches of a congratulatory and encouraging nature were made by Governor Hill, General Lois, president of the railroad, Joseph Gilmore, Walter Harriman, and others. Bountiful refreshments were provided by the citizens of Warner. The train returned to Concord late in the afternoon with nothing further to mar the occasion.
The length of the railroad from Concord to Warner was 18 miles. When the line extended to Bradford on July 10, 1850, the track was increased to a little more than 27 miles. The tracks ran along the Warner River and bisected the township of Warner in half, with Mount Kearsarge to the north and the Mink Hills to the south. Native Americans had camped and fished along the banks of the river, and the railroad probably had run along their paths. The tracks bisected agricultural fields, filled in wetlands, and wound through upland forests. Some people were not in favor of railroad development because of the taking of personal property and the risks of fire and accidents. Despite the concerns, the track was built and extended. Unfortunately, expenses were greater than receipts, and by 1852, the Concord and Claremont Railroad was bankrupt. It was merged in January of the following year with the New Hampshire Central Railroad to form a new corporation named the Merrimack and Connecticut Rivers Railroad Company. By 1874, this corporation had merged with the Sugar River Railroad and the Kentucket Valley Railroad, again forming the Concord and Claremont. But this time, it was under the control of the Northern Railroad.
There were 60 young Irish railroad workers listed in the 1850 U.S. Census in Bradford, just when the rail line was being expanded from Waterloo through Bradford. The construction of railroads in New England was concurrent with the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. As a result, Irish immigration to the United States increased dramatically. They were not welcome. They were seen as poor, ignorant, cunning, and violent persons who refused to assimilate. Newspapers regularly published stories lampooning them or reported on crimes involving them. Articles complained. They herd together in our cities and manufacturing villages and along the lines of our railroads, and by thus living in masses, they preserve their generic identity intact and all the habits and degradation of their race. These tropes are echoed for each unwelcome immigrant group to this day. In August of 1848, there was an incident of violence between Irish work gangs from Cork and Limerick, working on rail lines near Keene. The Keene Sentinel cited against the Cork group, stating, "Efforts are being made to arrest them or drive them into Vermont." In all seriousness, though, this article and others gives us some insight into the lives of these men. Their living quarters were substandard, described as shanties, and the accidents reported point to how dangerous the work was. And we would argue that incidents of violence were more because they were groups of young men living away from wives and parents than because they were Irish.
The train route eventually became the Claremont branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad, and by 1916, Warner had 3 passenger trains a day each way on weekdays and 1 train each way on Sundays. In summer, there was additional service with Pullman cars attached to the trains bringing summer tourists to the area. There were also daily freights each way, besides the Monday morning special for livestock and the express service.
This railroad map with the red line shows the trunk lines emanating out from Concord. The Concord-Claremont line shows stops at Garrison, River Hill, Mass Yard, the Kentucky Village, Warner, Waterloo, Melvin, Bradford, Lake Sunapee, Newberry, Edgemont, Sunapee, Newport, Claremont, and Claremont Junction. These were the regular stops along the route. Warner also had flag stops at Diamond, Bagley, Lower Warner, and Roby. A few feet from the track was a pole with a signaling device operated by a wager. If the train was supposed to stop, the large piece of metal at the top was pulled down to show red, a signal to the engineer to stop. Emery Bean wrote this poem about the Warner stations in 1927. Warner, home of the wildcat, house of the deer, where the air is pure and the water is clear, where Mount Kearsarge and the Mink Hills look down upon a thrifty people and a large busy town. Warner has many railroad stations, as you will see if you follow up through the hills with me. Diamond is first, as the northwest we go. Then comes Bagley, as most of you know. Lower Warner is where we next make a stop, with many nice houses back on the hilltops. To Warner proper, we are now drawing near. Then on to Waterloo, which years ago was great, as the home of some prominent men of our state. Roby is then reached after much curving around, but here, like Diamond, there is little I found. Melvin is next, is the last one to mention, so I'll thank you all for your close attention.
You'll see that Diamond Station is located, indicated by the arrow. Diamond was an unheated flag station located in Davisville. The mills at Davisville had a spur for shipping and receiving. Farmers in the Davisville and Webster area could deliver their milk, produce, or animals for market as well.
The Davis family operated a series of manufacturing opportunities at the mills in Davisville. It was in their best interest to have a spur track at this location. Nathaniel was a skilled mathematician, land surveyor, and at times a selectman and state representative. James was a miller by trade. Nathan operated a successful tavern on the stagecoach route from Concord to Hanover until the train came to Warner. Walter Davis and Samuel Dow dealt in hemlock bark and wood and lumber products, such as shingles, lath, and clapboards for several years. William Carter operated a paper mill, which burned in 1869. Eventually, the mill was rebuilt, as shown in this picture, and operated by the Davis family to manufacture straw board, an early type of pressed cardboard. Because they had to cart their goods to and fro from the spur track, it would be one of the reasons why Henry and Horace Davis would eventually move the paper mill to West Hopkinton in 1906. As you can see from this photo, water pollution laws had not been legislated yet, and it was not unusual for all the mills to dump their refuse into the water, waiting for high water to rush it downstream.
Some local entrepreneurs decided to take advantage of the tourist industry and established the Lake Tom Association, consisting of 50 persons holding shares valued at $5. With the money, the association leased a lovely grove of trees near the sandy shore, built a large pavilion, and opened it to the public. It consisted of a main hall 36 by 40 feet with a 10-foot piazza in front and a cook room located in the back. The establishment opened for business on July 4th, 1884. The Diamond Station served as a stop to disembark families for a day of swimming, boating, and picnicking on its shores. Unfortunately, 10 years later, sparks from a locomotive set fire to the woods at Diamond's Corner in May of 1894. The fire spread rapidly, burning the grove of woods and destroying the pavilion. It was not rebuilt. However, there is still a Thomspon Association today.
Due to a lack of use with the closing of manufacturing in the area and summer tourists arriving at the boarding houses and inns in Davisville by car, the Diamond Station closed in 1939 and was moved down the road to be used as a summer cabin. If you take the back road to Kentucky, this station sits on the property, currently the home of Magtech and Knoxland. It is the tan-colored building with red trim.
The arrow on this map shows the location of the Bagley Station. Samuel Dow was a self-made man. He went to work at a very early age to assist his father in supporting the family. Charles Davis hired him for 7 months at $10 a month to work in his mill in Davisville. Dow saved his money and rented the Charles Davis mill to saw and bunch shingles. With that money, he began buying and manufacturing lumber, which led to buying 1/2 interest in the Nathaniel Davis sawmill. After purchasing both operations, he sold them for a tidy profit in 1857. He purchased land in Canaan, New Hampshire, and set up mills, which his oldest son, Hervey, helped to manage. With his financial success, Dow also purchased a store in Davisville and developed 3 large business blocks in Concord, New Hampshire. Bagley probably had a small unheated station at the beginning. It was due to Samuel Dow's influence that the passenger station, store, and post office developed. The store in the foreground was operated by his son-in-law, Fred Savory. It was built in the 1880s and burned in 1919. The passenger station was located behind the store. The building below was the freight station where farmers delivered the milk cans in the morning for the run to Concord.
This image shows the train pulling into the station on a very snowy morning. Marion Savory shares this memory about this station. One very cold winter night, 2 men walked up the track and entered the depot. The neighbors, curious to know what they were doing in the area when no train was due for hours, watched intently. It became dark and a light was visible through the end window for some time. Finally, it disappeared and the 2 men came out and walked off up the track. The next morning, upon investigation, it was found that a fire had been built on the board floor, probably for warmth or to heat food. How they did it without burning the building is still a mystery, for it was a very windy night and the boards were old and dry. In those days, men of the road frequently traveled on the railroad tracks. There wasn't a law to forbid their stopping at houses to ask for a handout. When it was discovered a kind housewife provided bread, sandwiches, donuts, or some similar food in a paper bag, they were apt to get frequent visitors. It seemed the men managed to leave some sign for followers, stones neatly piled a certain way, or a mark on the family fence or guidepost. Men of the road, also called tramps and hobos, represented a highly mobile, unskilled labor force. Their heyday was the 1870s through the 1920s. During this time, the economy was unstable, employment fluctuated, and unemployment was chronic with no social safety nets. The railroad and the telegraph greatly aided these internal migrants in their search for work over wide geographical areas.
This image shows the covered railroad bridge in the commodious Dow Barns to the right. The covered bridge was eventually removed and replaced with a steel bridge, which still stands today. Grain for the store was unloaded from the freight cars on the spur tracks located just behind the building. There were horse sheds connected to the lower side of the store where farmers could drive their horses under cover in severe weather while they waited for the milk train. By 1941, the Bagley Station was no longer being used as a flag stop, and the building was purchased by John Kirk and moved to Thomspon.
Some distance beyond the Bagley Railroad crossing, a longer spur track branched off to the right into what was called the wood yard, where there was a good deal of activity for many years. Cordwood, lumber, and apples were loaded on cars and shipped from there to their destinations. My father, Fred Courser, shipped this load of lumber to the Brown Paper Company in Berlin from this siding. On
the map, you'll see the Lower Warner Station. Lower Warner used to be considered the main village of Warner until the early 1840s. The extended Joshua George family operated farms and businesses in the neighborhood, including a store, the Lower Warner Meeting House, post office, and tavern. It was probably their influence that a flag stop was included at this location. This is a view of Lower Warner, was taken from Walt Ingall's field located on Schoodiac Road, which is now exit 8 off Interstate 89. The covered bridge over the Warner River is on the left. The Lower Warner Schoolhouse was the white building in the foreground. The bridge over the railroad bed was just before the Lower Warner Station. You can see the roof of the station to the right of the bridge. Corn shucks are stacked in the field, and Ingall's hayfield has just been mown. The intervales on both sides of the track would flood during periods of high water.
The neighborhood children loved to hang an apple on a string from the bridge for the engineer to catch on his way by. Another favorite trick was to try to drop pennies into the smokestack. I bet they also laid pennies on the track to be flattened.
Here's the Lower Warner Station with members of the Nesmith, Ingalls, Wilkins, Nelson, and Hackleton families posing for a photograph. The man on the far right in the white hat was Ed Dudley. Ed was known as Everyday Dudley, as he met the train regularly to see if anyone needed a ride home. It's probably his horse and carriage in the background.
Sibley Wilkins remembers, once my brother and I, with two friends, had a canoe trip from Warner down the river to Davisville, where we carried the canoe around the dam and into the rapids below, and followed the river to its entrance into the Kentucky River. We stopped for our picnic lunch on its banks and continued on to the Pennacook State Park above the big dam. By late afternoon, we paddled back to River Hill, carried our canoe to the little station, setting the signal for the so-called 7 p.m. train. When it stopped, we put the canoe in the baggage car, ourselves in the coach, and returned to Warner without any paddling against the current or carrying around the dam. The train was a great help to having a perfect day.
This is Sibley Wilkins again. All during my early summers, the train was one of the delights of Warner. It carried my family every June on the last lap of our trip from Washington, D.C. to Warner, and stopped for us at the Lower Warner Flag Station, a little one-room shelter with a bench on its long outside platform on the north side of the old cemetery. At the side would be our surrey with the fringe on top for us to ride up to the house. During the summer, we would walk down, set the signal, and catch the train to Warner at a cost of 5 cents, or travel to Waterloo for a dime. We paid the conductor, whom we knew well. The Lower Warner Station was bought by Pat Quinn, a track supervisor, and moved to Thomspon, probably between 1939 and 41.
Warner's main depot is shown on the map. Coming into the depot across the flats, this is a great view of the tracks leading to the main depot in the Warner Village, the Warner River, and the Dalton Joppa covered bridge on the left. This must be a spring picture, as the water in the intervale indicates the river recently flooded its bank. A wooden fence has been erected to keep animals and people from crossing the tracks, and telegraph lines run parallel to the rails.
This photograph of the main depot complex was probably taken from the roof of the Warner and Kearsarge Mountain Hotel, which stood where the Pillsbury Free Library is located today. The hotel tragically burned on the night of January 29, 1885. Luckily, it took no other buildings with it. The building in the middle ground was originally the barn of George Jones. Arthur Thompson purchased it in 1883 and converted it to a warehouse. In 1884, he added a 2-story building in the rear and used it as a store and billiard parlor. 2 years later, it was converted into a corn brush and broom factory, and the Grange met on the 2nd floor. The roof line of the covered bridge over the Warner River stands in the background. A new metal bridge replaced it in 1903.
This was the first station built in Warner for the opening of the railroad in 1849. William Henry Dole was the first station agent until John Kimball replaced him in 1851. The outside stairs were removed in October 1893. For many years, the Independent Order of the Good Templars, Purity Lodge number 42, held their meetings on the third floor of the depot. On the platform is a cart with milk cans ready to be picked up. Several people are standing in front of the depot and a team of oxen are waiting patiently with their driver. The tall building in the background is the Merrimack Glove Factory, which was built in 1873 and burned on February 25, 1890. The wooden structure across the tracks is filled with cords of wood. Notice the wide dirt road and imagine how muddy it must have been after a good rainstorm or spring thaw. In October 1889, the railroad company hired Moses Howlett to take down part of the woodshed as it was in a dilapidated condition. He also put an addition onto the tank house and 2 more tanks were built to store water. A railroad car sits on the siding in front of the freight house waiting to be filled or emptied. This photograph was taken before 1889 based on the information above.
Inez and George Brockway stand patiently on the station platform. George was station agent at the main depot from 1896 until 1937. Sibley Wilkins again shares a memory. Every train was welcomed by a big crowd and the unloading of express, freight, and mail took some minutes. It was here that President Theodore Roosevelt stopped on his way to visit Secretary of State John Hay in Sunapee. He made a little speech on the rear platform to the many that came for a glimpse of him. I had wiggled my way up near the train, and when it started, he threw a bunch of sweet peas someone had given him. I caught them with great pride. The Kearsarge Independent reported that his visit to Warner was a scant 5 minutes at 5:45 p.m. on September 4th, 1902.
Mrs. Brockway kept a beautiful flower garden across the track and along the river. The Boston and Maine Railroad offered prizes for the best flower gardens at stations as part of a beautification program. There was also a footbridge that led to the ball field from the depot where the famous weekend baseball games were played between Warner and neighboring towns. People would arrive on the train to cheer their favorite team to victory.
This is a view of Station Agent Brockway's desk. Notice the telegraph machine in the middle of the desk and the kerosene lamp. The windows got pretty grimy from the smoke of that lamp. Is that an early typewriter we can see to the left? Sibley Wilkins remembers, one of the hazards of the railroad was setting fires. In August, especially, a dry season gave everyone anxiety. The 4 p.m. train used to spit sparks out of its smokestack, and the dry grass would easily begin to burn and spread up the side hill toward the houses and barns. Everyone would go out with wet brooms and beat it out. Once it made great headway across from Foster's in Lower Warner and was getting near the woods. I remember hearing that if a wide strip was cut with a plow, the fire would stop spreading, and I got someone to plow such a strip right across Clarence Foster's garden. As a matter of fact, the fighters stopped the spreading of the fire before it reached the strip, and Mr. Foster was furious to have his garden damaged. But during those years, I was often called to the ticket office at the Warner Station by Mr. Brockway and given $2.75 to $3.75 for fighting fires set by the railroad.
Over 16 tons of express matter was handled at this station during the month of August in 1911, being the amount received and sent according to the Kearsarge Independent. Notice the baggage cart on the platform. In the upper right, you can just see the metal pipe hanging in the air that was lowered to add water to the steam engine when it stopped. The station agent's office was the little bump out onto the platform. 2 hotels and a livery station were located near the main depot. Across the street was the Colonial Inn, and up the street the Kearsarge Hotel and Payne Davis livery stable.
Arthur Thomson converted the old C.W. Adams grain store located across from the main depot into a hotel in 1899 to accommodate 12 guests.
It was such a success, he decided to add a third floor, bathrooms, and electric lights to serve 75 visitors. Later, a covered pavilion, golf course, lawn tennis courts, croquet grounds, and boats for exploring the Warner River assisted in luring guests to visit his establishment. He operated his successful enterprise until 1914, when he sold it to Mr. Cheeseborough. During the snow train era, it was known as Pleasant Valley Inn or Pleasant Valley Ranch.
Nehemiah Ordway built the Kearsarge Hotel from his former laundry building after his Warner and Kearsarge Mountain Hotel burned in January 1885. Payne Davis and his family operated the hotel and livery stable for several years. Payne is probably the tall man standing on the second floor porch. Later, this hotel was known as the Adams House, and even later, the Kearsarge Inn.
The glove company started manufacturing gloves, vests, and pants made of leather in 1880. Both of their buildings were destroyed by fire in 1890. 10 years later, they were both rebuilt and the new Merrimack glove factory was formed. 7 years later, fire struck again and one of the large wooden buildings was saved. For a couple of years, boots were made in the facility. Bobbins, toys, storage for cold and building supplies, and woodworking were some of the later goods that were manufactured and shipped from the main depot.
Harold Dow then purchased the building and operated a sawmill with lumber for sale. Carl Cutting made baseball bats on the second floor. In 1938, it was the site of the Henniker Crutch Factory and Warner Woodworking.
In 1884, Mason and John Eda built an addition to the sawmill for manufacturing wooden box shooks and wooden boxes. The railroad built an overpass so the logs could be rolled down to the mill from the freight cars. This mill burned in 1964.
Jacob Adams built a grain store on the land he purchased from the railroad in 1898. His son Clarence sold the grain store to Lewis Shaw and Fred Courser in May 1911. The large building on the right burned in 1928. Merrimack Farmers Exchange would operate in this location for several years. Later, it was home for the Warner Grange, and the building was later torn down after the Grange disbanded.
The Warner and Kearsarge Fairgrounds, located on the Interville, operated from 1875 to the late 1890s. There were so many people attending that eventually the railroad put in a separate siding and platform for passengers and freight to disembark right at the fairgrounds.
The site of the chemical plant was on the former location of the Warner and Kearsarge Fairgrounds. This plant burnt 3 times. It was probably due to cooking the wood at such a high heat to manufacture charcoal and the byproducts of wood alcohol, acetate of lime, and chemicals for dye. It produced about 1 boxcar of 50 to 55 barrels each week and used about 1 car of soft coal a month. The charcoal was packaged in 50-pound bags.
The next 2 photographs show the railroad crew posing for their picture. Crews were responsible for maintaining the track, shoveling snow in winter, putting out fires, and assisting with daily loading and unloading of various types of freight.
Cattle, hogs, poultry, and sheep from Warner were loaded into freight cars every Monday morning. It was said the crew could load anything that could walk, but nothing that had to be dragged in. Carloads of apples were among the many other Warner products shipped by freight. The laborers who worked on the crew were usually from Warner or surrounding towns. Warner men also worked for the railroad in other towns or even other states. They were part of the local migratory labor pool, as opposed to the hobos who had a wider geographical area that they traversed. Railroad work was only one type of labor these men did throughout their lives. many can be found in the census laboring on farms or in woodlots in other years. Other young men became skilled laborers, farm owners, or small business owners as they matured. This is in contrast to the station agents and engineers who tended to stay within management or skilled labor positions throughout their careers. It was not unusual for station agent and postmaster positions to pass to family members. In Warner, we see this at Melvin Mills with the Melvin family, at Bagley with the Dow family, at Roby with the Roby family, and at Waterloo with the Gage family.
The new mail is coming into the main depot. People could receive mail practically every time a train came through. Going to the station to collect your mail was a social event of the day. Notice how close to the tracks the train is to the Warner River. During times of high water, usually in the spring or fall, the tracks could be covered with water and washouts would occur, needing to be repaired quickly to maintain service.
This is the main depot in winter looking eastward. Notice the number of tracks. One track is for daily traffic and 2 sidings are for freight. The railroad crew would need to shovel the snow after every storm, and notice the very high snowbanks.
Warner was host to America's first snow train in December 1931. The Boston and Maine Railroad brought 400 skiers from Boston. The ski area across the river from the main depot had not yet been developed. The first skiers would hike up the Breakneck Hill or Warner's more challenging climbs, such as Kearsarge Street, Torrey, and Pumpkin Hill. The development of the ski area in 1943 enticed businessmen to invest in local hotels, such as the Kearsarge Inn, the Pleasant Valley Inn, the Mountain View, Maple Ridge, and Stony Brook, just to name a few. The Warner Planning and Development Committee visited businesses in the Boston area to entice them to bring their workers to recreate in Warner for their annual employee outings.
The John Hancock Life Insurance Company brought over 1,400 employees north during the winter of 1955. This is at a time when the population of Warner was only about 1,000. Organizations, school and church groups were solicited to assist in hosting these large events. Turkey shortcake with biscuits, potatoes, squash, Warner River coffee, and apple pie were served at various locations around town. The funds raised helped organizations sponsor social events or make needed repairs to their buildings. The Simons-free high school students were able to raise money for class trips to Washington, D.C. or New York City. The inns and boarding houses were able to pay their employees town taxes and had enough left over to enjoy a tidy profit.
This is the map showing the location at Waterloo. Members of the Nehemiah Ordway family gazed down on the railroad station on the left, the covered bridge, the home of John Gage, the station agent, and the old Waterloo Cemetery. The sign reads, "Railroad crossing. Look out for the engine when the bell rings." Why did the train stop here? The Bean family had extensive interest in the mills in this location as well as substantial farms. Later, it would also be the influence of Warner native Nehemiah Ordway, a Republican, served as Sergeant of Arms for the U.S. House of Representatives, a friend of Lincoln's, governor of the Dakota Territories, and an all-around entrepreneur. U.S. Senator and Concord resident William E. Chandler had his summer home in Waterloo. Summer residents also include members of the Walter Harriman and the John Curtis Ager families. Many visitors were entertained during the high season of summer.
These are the engine and cars of the Concord and Claremont Railroad. Nehemiah Ordway is probably the tall man standing on the station platform. Sibley Wilkins shares this story. One time when the Ordways left Waterloo to head back to Bismarck, North Dakota, and all were accounted, it was discovered that all their food had been left at the Waterloo Station. What could be done? Nothing until Concord. There were no telephone lines to Warner, but a telegraph office at the Waterloo Station. So Nehemiah sent a telegram to his trusted black servant, Clarence Stewart, telling him to harness 2 of the fastest horses to a wagon, put in all the food, and drive over the back roads to Potter Place. The train from Concord to Montreal would reach there about noon. This was done, and as the train came into Potter Place, the horses, foaming at the mouth, tore up the road, bringing the food. All was saved.
Doug and Fred Davis were delivering wood to the station to be picked up at the siding or perhaps delivered to the mill just past the station. Cords of wood in the winter months were delivered to both railroad station and mills along the river, providing much needed income for farm families.
Mr. Gage is waiting for the engine to stop. His bicycle's leaning against the station building. The daily trains made many stops and delivered mail to the 6 post offices within the town limits. If there were no passengers to get on or off, the train slowed and the mail bags were thrown aboard or plucked from the hanger beside the track. Can you see the mail bag clipped to the pole?
The new Waterloo Station was built in 1910. This photo looks like it was taken soon after completion, as everything, including the landscaping, seems new. Mr. Gage stands on the platform. Gage and later his son Roger were the station agents at Waterloo. Roger and his wife would operate a youth hostel from their home for several years. Stephen Bean wrote about his experiences at this station. The baggage room occupied the building's rear. There was located the Cracker Barrel and an ice box, from the cool depths of which Roger Gage would pull out quart-sized bottles of homemade root beer on the rare occasions when children or grown-ups had 5 cents to squander. On rainy days, it was good news to a boy when father said, "Son, after you finish slopping the hogs, you better hitch up Joe. Go fetch the milk cans at the depot, and while you're there, pick up 2 bushels of oats and a bag of middlings next door." The arrival at Waterloo of the 4:30 up train from Concord, which may have picked up a passenger or 2 from the express leaving Boston at noon, was the occasion for a community gathering. It had 2, or on Fridays and Saturdays in the summer, 3 passenger coaches, as well as a mail and baggage car.
Stephen Bean continues. The front room was dingy and drab. Roger Gage, the station agent and postmaster, kept the windows clean, but the floor was dark and worn with stains from muddy boots over the years. The pot-bellied wood-burning stove stood in the center, its rusty pipe angling to the chimney at the far end. Heavy benches were nailed to 2 walls. Backed to a 3rd wall were sparsely laden grocery display shelves. A glass case contained a few loose pounds of gray-looking chocolates and some dried out packs of lawn beans, 3 for 5 cents cigars. Roger always told his customers candy and tobacco improved with age. On the 4th side, the station agent had his narrow office. On the walls were B&M Railway advertisements inviting excursions to such alluring places as Sunapee Lake and distant Hampton Beach. Even more exciting were the posters avidly describing train robbers wanted dead or alive. Many a farm lad and summer boy waiting for the afternoon train to come, returning empty milk cans and chicken crates, painstakingly read about these desperados and wished that he could capture one of them and receive the $500 fortune.
Stephen Bean continues. The depot is gone, but there are those who remember when they heard the first faint, long woo clear down the track at Colby's Crossing. Farmers would pull big silver watches on leather thongs from overall pockets and say, "Bill is 5 minutes late this afternoon, but he can make it up on the straight run through Melvin's." Great fun was a game of putting one's ear to the rail and listening who first could detect the haunting, thin, high-pitched song of steel as the train came nearer. Then we would hear the faraway whistle, and in 3 or 4 minutes, old 57 would come around the bend. There was a clattering of metal and the wild clanging of the bell, the hiss of escaping steam as the train ground to a halt.
Greetings were called back and forth as the baggage man tossed jugs and crates into the waiting carts. The engineer leaned from his cab and swapped greetings. The conductor watched while the unloading went on. Then he waved his arm to the engineer and shouted, "All aboard!" whether anyone was getting on or not. There was a series of short, loud, sharp, staccato blasts as the engineer opened the throttle. The wheels took hold, the bell clanged, and the train started toward the next station. As a farmer's boy drove home and heard the lonesome-sounding whistle far up the line toward Burnt Hill, he made a promise to himself. Someday he would be on that train, riding away to life's high adventure, even perhaps to the halls of Congress or a distant state capitol.
And now we come to Roby. This bird's eye view captured the cluster of buildings around the railroad station shown underneath the arrow. The covered bridge on the foreground over the river leads to South Sutton. The dark colored house and barn are the home and barn of Moses and Ida Roby. If you remember, Moses would be the station agent. The Eastman family lived in the White House, and the barn was across the street just in front of the railroad covered bridge. The Morgan farm was across the river, and in the distance, the White Duck Inn. Annie Cogswell remembers, the railroad was extended from the main depot in Warner to Roby late in the fall of 1849. For about several months, it was the end of the line, and the stagecoach used to come in from and go out to Sutton and Bradford. The line was extended into Bradford by July 10, 1850, and that was the end of the line for several years, as engineers tried to solve the problem of the rocky obstacle of Newberry Cut in order to extend the line to Newport and Claremont. By 1871, the line had been opened 15 miles between Bradford and Newport. By the following year, the line was completed from Concord to Claremont, a run of 58 miles, which took 40 years to complete.
Jack Holbrook was the first station agent, serving until 1854. Moses Roby was the next agent, and he served in that position for over 50 years. The station and the area acquired its name from his family. At that time, the station was small and an unimportant one, and if Moses wished to leave it for a day or two, it didn't take much time to train a substitute as the duties were light.
But as years went by, the station became an important freight depot for the Reddington and Bartlett Brother mills. Thousands of feet of wood and lumber and hundreds of carloads of Excelsior were shipped from this railhead. In 1904, 190 carloads of Excelsior were sent from the Bartlett Brothers Excelsior mill alone. Winter was a good time, depending on the conditions, for local teamsters to haul lumber to the various mills and stations in the area. Jack Mead, shown in this photo, is bringing his load of wood to the Roby Station.
The Reddington Hub Company manufactured hubs, woodenware, Excelsior, and clothespins at various times. The business was operated by Oliver Reddington, and later his son Charles joined him in that enterprise. In 1900, the mill received 100 cords of elm wood from throughout the state at their siding in Roby. Elm was used in hub manufacturing because the closeness of the grain lent itself to being tough to split, and hubs would hold up under the tension of the turning wheels. The Abbott and Downing Company purchased hubs for their freight wagons and stagecoaches.
In February 1905, the hub shop burned to the ground during a blizzard. It is thought the fire started in the room where the hubs were dipped in resin. The loss was $10,000, and unfortunately, but not unusual, the Reddingtons carried no insurance, despite the loss of a previous factory to fire. This image shows the rebuilding of the dam by Frank Hill and his employees in late fall of 1911.
In July 1911, the sparks from the locomotive set fire to the covered railroad bridge. There was a delay in train service until a temporary bridge was installed and then replaced by this structure. Frank Varney was a photographer who lived in Melvin Mills and took this image of men replacing the covered bridge with a steel structure. Station Master Moses Roby's farm is in the background on the left, and the covered bridge to South Sutton is on the right.
The Bartlett Excelsior Mill lay between Roby and Melvin's. Parker Bartlett and his sons purchased the mill in the spot to manufacture wooden pails and tubs, but soon converted the mill to produce fine and coarse Excelsior. Coarse Excelsior was used for packing like we use peanuts today, and fine Excelsior was used to stuff upholstery, mattresses, chairs, and even baseball gloves.
The building was destroyed by fire in 1893 and rebuilt. Fire struck again in 1905, and despite not having insurance, was built again. Both of these fires were attributed to sparks from the train. The 1905 fire was discovered in the evening. Help was summoned from Concord, and a special train with a fire steamer and 25 men hurried to the scene, making the run in about 30 minutes. They had hoped to make it to the Melvin Mills station and come back on the road, but instead they had to back down to the Roby Station because the trestle was on fire. By the time the steamer was unloaded, horses secured, and the drive of over a mile completed, the fire was beyond control and it became a cleanup operation instead.
It would be several weeks before the trestle was fully repaired and the mill rebuilt. In the meantime, trains would run up to the trestle, passengers and goods would be unloaded to walk down around the trestle and reboard the train waiting on the other side.
And the map is going to show the last stop, Melvin, also known as Mill Village, Melvin's, and Melvin's Mills. This is a bird's eye view of Melvin Mills with Bible Hill in the background. The white buildings on the left was John Rogers' bedstead factory on the first floor, and the Sawtell Grange met on the second floor. The train station was the dark building located behind the mill. The dam to the left powered the Melvin family's grist and sawmill. A stop was included here because of the Melvin family.
The Melvin Station was built in 1850 when the route was being expanded to Bradford. The station was probably located here because of the number of mills in the area. Josiah Melvin, the patriarch of the family, had operated a grist and sawmill at the Falls. His extended family continued the milling tradition. The Rogers, Stevens, and Pierce families produced wooden stoppers, processed wool, manufactured chairs, and bedsteads. Area of Newmarket and Collins and Bible Hill. Proctor Melvin was probably the station agent in 1860. He died in 1866. His son Walter Melvin, shown standing in front of the door, would eventually become the station agent after 1880.
Walter Melvin stands to the left of the station in this photo. He always wore a big hat and had a dog by his side. He also tended a garden next to the depot, and a bench sits in the shade for people to rest and wait for the next up or down train. Notice the bridge to Bible Hill and Newmarket Road has covered trusses. In 1921, the freight and passenger business was discontinued and Melvin Mills became a flag station. The post office was located in the station. After Walter's death in 1922, Oscar Rickard bought the store and became postmaster. Later, Ansel Mosier bought the store and post office. His wife Florence became postmistress in 1942 and managed the train station, store, and gas station. The Melvin station closed on June 30th, 1955.
This is a peaceful scene of the Warner River and the Melvin Station on the right. The Melvin Mill Station was torn down by Roger Weber in 1960 when he built a small house. Later, Chris and Ellen Mayo built a house that looks similar to the old station on the same site. Only the main depot and Waterloo stations remain in their original locations.
And here we see the Bradford Station stop. The Bradford Station was the final stop for many years until the route was pushed through the Newberry Cut to Lake Sunapee. The village had a robust manufacturing center and local hotels to serve the public. The stagecoach and freight wagons were also brought people and goods to hotels in Sutton and New London. The freight traffic dropped substantially between 1955 and 1961. In 1955, 191 cars of freight were shipped from this location compared to only 84 in 1961. Cressy and Williams had gone out of the farm machinery business in 1958, and Merrimack Farmers Exchange had cut their shipments by half. Many businesses and companies that used to ship by rail had switched to trucking, leading to a loss of income for the rail line.
This is the infamous Newberry cut that had to cut through. Dorothy Sawyer shared this story about the winter of 1920. They were living in Newberry, and her father was a shoveler for the railroad. The snow was extremely deep. All the stone walls and gateposts were covered. Word had gone out that the train had gotten stuck in the cut. Men thought the down train could probably push the up train out, but it didn't work, and both trains were stuck. There wasn't enough coal on either train to burn to keep the passengers warm. After a time, oxen and horses were hired and founded through the deep snow with sleds to pick up the passengers. Families in the area took the passengers in for the night. The shovelers worked all day and night to clear the tracks for the train to move. Dan Fortune said he was so tired, the seat of his pants dragged on every tie he walked over.
It was not unusual to have 7 trains daily traveling this stretch of railroad on weekdays. During the summer, on Sundays, long excursion trains made the round trip to Lake Sunapee from Boston. 6 steamers on the lake met the up train at Lake Sunapee Station around 10 a.m. and after a trip around the lake, returned the passengers to the train which left for Boston around 5 p.m.
The note on this photograph stated it was one of the last steam-powered passenger runs on the B&M Railway. It was taken just before the trestle at Melvin's by Clifford Rogers, who lived in the neighborhood. Service for the passenger train stopped in Warner on November 4th, 1955, a sad day. Before the advent of the railroad, the mills along the Warner River sold their products locally or within delivery distance using freight wagons. The men who invested in the railway in 1848 envisioned the multitude of possibilities that the railroad would bring to the Warner and surrounding communities. It would mean that mills along the river would eventually ship to Concord, Manchester, Boston, New York, the Eastern Seaboard, and beyond. Farmers increased their production of goods that could be shipped to market: milk, butter, cheese, cattle, sheep, swine, poultry, apples, maple sugar. Eventually, Western markets were able to produce agricultural products in greater abundance and cheaper. This ability encroached on the New England market, forcing farmers to come up with different products. Still, with the advent of summer tourism, farmers were able to supply the local hotels and boarding houses with fresh food. The development of better roads and trucking systems would eventually cause the railroad to slowly close these rail lines that were no longer profitable. Many mills gradually closed their businesses along the river or moved to other locations. The last freight train made its journey in 1961. Soon the tracks in town were torn up and sold for scrap metal. It was the end of the railroad era.
A new era is now being created by the development of rail trails along the original railroad beds for people to walk, ski, or bike along. Bulletin boards at trailheads include historical information about the area, and the Pillsbury Free Library has added kiosks featuring a rail trail story walk for families.
Join us on June 26 to learn more about how the railroad affected Warner's agriculture and rural industries.
And then join us again on July 16th to learn about hotels, boarding houses, and summer visitors in relation to the railroad. Email info@warnerhistorical.org to receive a Zoom link to these free programs.
Also, check out our online Torrey Hill Author Series on 4 Saturday evenings in July and August. Tickets for these events are $5 each. You will receive a Zoom link upon purchase online at torreyhillauthorseries.com.
So thank you very much. If you have a question, just unmute yourself, or you can even type it into the chat and hopefully we'll see it.
Lynn, do you want me to get out of the PowerPoint?
No, you can leave it. It's fine.
Okay. Mhm.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, David.
I actually have a few questions. So I was following interesting talk. I was following along on Google Satellite View, and it appears that the railroad right-of-way is completely obliterated. I couldn't find any evidence of it anywhere. Is that correct?
Well, no, I don't think so. Rebecca, do you know where it goes in? I mean, in Kentucky, it goes right in back of my house. So portions of it are still visible.
Yeah,
You know, through Warner?
I would say if you Google the Concord Lake Sunapee Rail Trails, they have a great map up on their site, which shows the trails that they've opened up already and the trails that they're
What
working
was the
on.
name of the rail trail? Concord Lake Sunapee?
Concord to Lake Sunapee.
Okay, I'll do that. You pop that up right at the end.
Yes.
So I think you said the only two built depots that are still left in their original locations are Waterloo and Warner, at the main depot in Warner.
Yeah.
So is
Yes.
the Waterloo one now part of the R.C. Brayshaw Company building?
Yes, it's still owned by R.C. Brayshaw.
Looks like it's a part on the west, and looks like the Warner building it shows up in the satellite view too.
Right. The main depot is now apartments.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I have.
I
Judy,
had
you have a
one
question?
more comment. You had a picture of the I think it was the box mill that burned, you said, in 1954. And parked out front of it was either a 1955 Ford or a 1956 Ford. So
I'm sorry if I said 54. It's really in the 60s.
okay, that would explain why the car was there.
Oh, you're so observant.
Judy,
There
did you have
weren't
a
many
question?
pictures in your presentation that had automobiles in them.
No, it was just excellent. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So
Yeah,
much
very
research.
good program. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? We're getting
would
some
just
over
like
the
to-
chat. That's very nice.
Lynn and Rebecca, Ed Dawson up in Colebrook.
Hi, Ed.
Very nice presentation, having lived in Warner for about 18 years. A lot of familiar places and some of the places I didn't know.
Well, I'm glad you learned something new, Ed.
It's been a good day.
Good.
Hi, Nadine.
Hi, that was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Really, really fabulous.
Okay, I'm
Looking
leaving.
forward to the next series.
Great.
Thank you.
Hello, Rebecca. This is Steve Goss in Maryland.
Oh, hi, Steve.
Ellen.
And hello, Lynn. Nice to see you.
Hi, Steve.
I enjoyed the talk. Sorry I can't get up there.
Well, this is a nice way of doing it. Actually, we're getting a lot of people who don't live here in Warner to come to these programs, and so it's a great way to expand our audience.
A lot of groups are doing it that way, and it's really working out quite well.
Yes.
I wonder if we should try to do like a hybrid in-person and online format in the future. I don't know how yet, but might be interesting.
That's a good idea.
Rebecca and Lynn, I will say that my group, the Mass Bay Railroad Enthusiasts, did a Zoom program for the first time last month, and we had twice as many people as we've ever had at one of our live presentations. Similar experience to what you just saw. A lot of people that are in other parts of the country or whatever, and we're contemplating the same thing. How do we expand our live programs to be able to present them online at the same time?
I'm reading the chat comments that are coming up. They're very nice. Okay, do we have any more questions?
Okay, I'm leaving. Leave meeting.
You'll expect to see an email from me really soon, maybe even this evening. It's an evaluation form. If you just reply to the email, answer the questions, and send it back, it would be really great.
One other thing, we've recorded this program, so we hope to put it on our website for those people who weren't able to join us tonight, or if you want to share it with family and friends, that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again later this month. Bye.